Welcome to Horror Detour, my little vlog series where I pose a horror related question to you and we have a little back and forth about it. I've been thinking a lot recently, as we're approaching Halloween, about how people watch horror films. And one of the things that gets me is that most people don't, except for at Halloween. Most people are not like us. We are probably horror fans in a stellar scale. We love watching horror, listening to horror, and reading horror. But if you had a friend or someone close to you and you wanted to get them into horror, what film would you pick for them to watch? I often think about my wife. She doesn't like horror, really. I think it's mostly because of like jump scares and things like that she doesn't like. But there are certain things that will get her into kind of watching a horror film. And one of the movies, funnily enough, is the Daniel Radcliffe version of The Woman in Black. We went to see the stage show years ago, which is absolutely fantastic. If you haven't had a chance to see the stage show of The Woman in Black, it's really frightening and brilliantly done. So simple yet just so effective. And my wife also read the book, The Woman in Black, off of the back of that. And then she was a big Harry Potter fan, and the Daniel Radcliffe film was coming out a number of years ago, and so it was like, she said, I want to go to the cinema to see that. So we went to the cinema. There was a crowd of us, me, my wife, my brother-in-law, and a few of my friends. And if you've seen the Daniel Radcliffe film, it's jump scare after jump scare after jump scare. That's really how it gets you. I'm a fan of the original made-for-TV Women in Black film, which I think is built more on dread, like the book is. But there are moments with the newer version that it definitely got me. And, I think it's a decent horror film. But that was a horror film that got my wife into, like, okay, yeah, I'll go and watch a horror movie, because she'd sort of become invested in that specific story. And then at Halloween, in the month of October, that's when I'm allowed to put scary things on the TV while she's still up. But I think for a lot of people, they don't like horror because they do associate it with it maybe messing with their heads a little bit, or they associate it with that kind of anxious, nerve-shredded feeling. And some people don't like that, some people do. But it's interesting to me, what films are out there that could persuade someone that horror is for them. Now, I've tried a number of ones with my wife. I've tried to show old Universal horror movies, Hammer horror from the 60s, Amicus anthology films from the 60s and 70s. I've tried to show The Exorcist, which, funnily enough, rated as one of the scariest films ever made. And my wife didn't find that frightening at all. And I think that's because that movie only has like 1 or 2 jump out scares in the whole thing. The rest of it is built on just the dread and the horrible trauma of that situation in The Exorcist. I remember watching The Haunting, the original 1963 film, which is one of my all-time favourite horror films. And there's a jump out scare in that movie, a really effective one that comes out of nowhere, considering that the rest of the movie is kind of built on dread. And I remember my wife turning around looking at me and being like, you told me there were no jump out scares in this. And I just totally forgot about that one, to be honest. So I wouldn't say that I was able to convert my wife into a horror fan, but certainly there's been some horror films that we've been able to enjoy together, partly because of The Woman in Black. I think that kind of at least got my wife into kind of watching some of those movies, but more often than not, it's around Halloween. What do you think would be a good gateway horror film then? What horror film would you pick? to get someone else into the horror genre, someone who like never watches it or only watches horror at Halloween. I think you have to be careful when you're picking that movie, because like I said, I showed my wife films from like the 40s through 50s, 60s, 70s. Some of those movies are what I call cozy horror. They're not frightening, they're a little bit eerie, but they just have this lovely warmth to them. And in the way that you get when you're sort of being told a spooky story when you're a kid. I love that, and there's a hokiness to some of those films now, because with our modern cinema sensibilities, we look at those movies and we think, oh, that looks fake or that looks cheap. But I actually prefer a lot of that stuff to a lot of what you see now in modern cinema. I prefer practical effects most of the time over CG and things like that. But my wife was like watching some things and she's like, really, this isn't scary at all, that looks silly. So there's like two ends of the spectrum. There's too scary and there's not scary enough. And I think when you're trying to get a gateway horror film to someone, you have to get that movie that's kind of slap bang in the middle. It's scary enough to give them that effect of an enjoyment of watching a horror film, but not so frightening that it's just going to put them off doing it again for the rest of their life. So I don't know what would be a really good one. I mean, most people have seen Jaws. Unless you've got a terrible fear of sharks, Jaws is probably, and most people do, but most people, I think, have seen Jaws and they maybe don't consider it a horror film, but I do consider it a horror movie, and I think that's a great one for a lot of people. Then there are horror movies that, or movies that play with horror themes and ideas, but maybe don't take them so seriously. One Halloween, we sat and watched some of the Abbott and Costello movies, and Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein and things like that. And that was a movie that, my wife sat and watched and she was like, this is really funny, this is really good. And I still got the universal horror kick out of it. So that was a good middle ground, that movie, for us. Another one was we watched you can't get it anywhere, but it's the animated version of Ray Bradbury's The Halloween Tree. And that's, again, a movie that plays with, it's animated, it's for kids really, but it deals with some pretty heavy ideas, and that's a good one for, it's kind of got that horror sensibility to it, but you can show it to someone that doesn't want to be scared. I think that'd also be a good one for kids to get them into horror films as well. Normally, there are certain things, like I watched again recently The Dark and the Wicked, which is I think a really frightening horror movie. So I watched it for a second time, and yeah, like I put it on, and I think I was watching it on my phone, actually, of all things. I was watching it on my phone, and I remember turning around to my wife and just going, yeah, this film would not be for you. And she's like, yeah. And then later I put the rest of it on the television, and when she was going to bed, she's like, yeah, I'm going to bed. I'm not watching this. This looks terrifying. So what film would you choose? Out of all the horror films that you know, all the horror movies that you've seen, which film would you choose to introduce someone to horror, or to even persuade someone who says they don't like horror into enjoying it? I'd love to hear some of your suggestions. Hopefully there's some movies that I haven't watched that you suggest, because that would be great. I'm always looking for good horror suggestions. So I hope you're all doing well. Let me know in the comments what you think about your best gateway horror movie, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bye for now.